So what I want to talk to you today, obviously, is how do you plan for an interactive project? And there are, unfortunately, many, many ways to approach an interactive project that, of course, is going to be specific to what it is that you are doing for your interactive project. But I do think that there are many things that everyone should think about, and maybe the order is going to be different for different people, but I do want to step you through some of these things to do at the early stage, which right now, especially given the NPPC 360 initiative, is the kinds of things that I think you should be thinking about. So before you submit an application, but well before you're in production. So if you want to stay connected with me and us, I am Adnaan Wasey, as Christian said, and my title is Executive Producer at POV Digital, and you can tweet at me at that handle, and then also you can connect with POV at pbs.org/POV, and our handle in many places like Twitter and Facebook is POV Docs. So we also have an initiative that's going on multiple times per year, but we're very actively excited about the POV Hackathon Lab right now because our next one is the weekend of November 8th and 9th. And our application deadline was actually last night at midnight, but if you're still interested after this presentation and you have some brilliant ideas, which I'm sure many of you do, then please, the application is still live, so you can still fill it out. And in the section that says, is there anything else I need to know, type in, Adnaan said I have an extension until Friday night. So you have that much time to fill it out if you'd like to. So that's POV Hackathon, and you can find out more about that there. And that's just for early stage projects as well. So very similar to what NBPC is asking for at this time. Okay, so how do you plan for an interactive project? It's tough, but we'll talk about some things, and I want to be very, very practical about this presentation. So I don't have a lot of quick slides. I'm just going to kind of linger on 2 slides and just talk to you about what I think are the best practices and things to think about. So feel free, I'm keeping my eye on the chat window, so feel free to keep asking questions, and there'll be a couple of times that we'll formally stop for questions, but feel free to jump in at any time for clarification or otherwise. But in that question, how do you plan for an interactive project? I actually think plan is a 4-letter word, and I think of it like a 4-letter word because I don't really like to plan in the way that we think about planning. So I don't like to make giant business plans. I don't like to make giant documents that lay out all the requirements. What I really want people to do when they think about interactive projects is not planning, but envisioning, and we'll get to talking about that and what that means and how that's different from planning. But I find that planning is very restrictive, and you get closed off too early. It's very rigid. You're not open to new ideas. And so even just the language that I use, I don't generally like to use the word plan. I'm saying it by default because it's in the title of this presentation, but very often I don't use the word plan. So, so we'll talk about that envisioning process, which I think is really critical, and it really is the first stage of getting somewhere. But before I do that, I want to just get very, very practical immediately, which is why I said that I want to hear a lot of feedback, because I want to hear what questions you have about the projects that you're working on. But there are 3 things that I really want to talk about immediately, which are the big questions of where's the funding for this? How do I find funding for this? How much should I ask for? And also, how do I find collaborators? Because presumably many of you are not technical people. So the question is always, how do I find a developer? How do I find a designer? How do I find a CTO for my company of this new idea that I have? And then the third part of this, just really practical, is what kind of skills do you need and what kind of skills could you get and how? So I'm just, like I said, I'm just going to linger on this and just talk to you about these things. So feel free to jump in with your comments. So the first thing about funding, and actually I want to point you to something. Let's see if this works. Yes, it does. Look at that. So there's a place on our website, and I'll make this bigger for people, which is a section for new media funding resources. And this is a great resource that I highly recommend if you're in the interactive documentary world or interactive project world, because these are people that are giving significant amounts of money. So research them. So the NBPC fund is new, so it's actually not in this list yet, but it will be soon. But you can see that there are people, some people here you may recognize, and also dollar amounts are here, so you can see for yourself which ones are worth going for, but there's Bayback, Cal Humanities, Creative Capital, the Fledgling Fund has a few here, IFP, ITVS, Jerome Foundation, NEA, NEH, the MacArthur Foundation. POV is also a funder of interactive documentaries, both short and long. Sundance, Tribeca Film Institute is very well known and is very generous also, and Vision Maker Media. And you'll see kind of amounts ranging from thousands of dollars up to something like $150,000. So the money is really there. And this new NBPC fund is really on the high end. So it's really exciting to see what is happening there. So I'm going to hide this, but really the easiest way to find this, you'll find it on POV's site, but you might even just Google or use your favorite search engine and type in new media funding resources, and you'll see this list again. So I'm going to hide that window again. So the question is, how much does it cost to make an interactive documentary? And there's no answer to that question. But for some people, it's $0, or it's not very much. And for other people, it's into the 6 figures. And it really just depends on the scope of your project and what you're trying to achieve. But I would think about your project as, think of it in a few buckets. What could you do for free? What's the possibility of using off-the-shelf tools? We'll point you to some of those also. Or using interactive video tools that already exist that are free. You can use social media, which doesn't cost anything. So there are many ways to do things that are free potentially. Or you could go the other route, or you have a giant team and you're hiring developers, or you're hiring an agency, and those things can add up pretty quickly. But for some projects, it's really the only way to go. So that's funding in a nutshell. You can do it cheaply. There are some tools. And I'm going to show you a list of interactive video tools that's on our website that you'll also be able to find, again, just by Googling. So I'll bring this over for you here. So this is a list of interactive video making tools, which again, if you just do a search for interactive video making tools, if you haven't done it already, you'll see this list. And so there are a few there. Some, you can see some are in beta and some are not free, but you can evaluate for yourself whether these are tools that will help you do what you want to do. Now, these tools are not perfect for everyone, but for many people, they'll be exactly what you were looking for. And the cost of these, like I said, could be free, which is a great price. So that's interactive video making tools. So are there any questions about funding? Are people having any specific issues about applying to funds or not knowing what they want, or really anything related to the theme of funding? I'm happy to pause for a few seconds, and if I see people typing, I will be happy to answer your questions. So I'm going to keep going, but if people do have questions about funding at any time, just put something like funding question : and then I'll come back to it. So the next question is about collaborators. And how do you find people? How do you find co-conspirators? The first question that people usually ask me is, can you connect me to a developer who can do this? And yes, it's true that I know many technologists, but the reality is that those kinds of introductions are usually not very fruitful. And the thing that I recommend if you are a filmmaker or a media creator who is not a technologist and looking for a technologist, it's really about networking. And it just comes back to the kind of the core thing of how do you get anything done in the business world. And it's a hustle at the same time, and it can be tough. But there are many ways you can reach out to people. So one way is presumably you have a social media account, whether it's your personal social media account or if it's a project social media account, and tweet and Facebook and use all those great free tools and let people know exactly what you're doing. Be really open about the kinds of things that you're hoping to do. And I've seen this experience where people blog, not with a desperate tone, but more like an inquisitive tone of, I wonder what it would take for someone to pair up with me on this project I'm working on. And I've never seen a bad thing happen from people putting themselves out in the world and saying, I'm looking for a collaborator. And you may find, and you'll usually find, that the people that come back to you are the people that are excited for reasons that you may not have thought are intuitive. They're maybe excited because they love the topic and they just never had an opportunity to work on something like that, and they will work at a cut rate to help you make your thing happen. or they're really excited about your vision. They might be really excited about working on a certain kind of technology that they haven't had an opportunity to work on before, or maybe that they're experts in the domain, but they're not really experts in the technology, and so you kind of fill that gap. So there's a lot of things offline that you can do. You can do social media, blogging. You can post on multiple boards. But the best kinds of boards are the ones that are connected to something else. So I'm a part of a couple of meetup groups, and meetups are a great way to meet people. And there are a lot of interdisciplinary meetups. It's just a matter of you, whatever city you're in. There are many in the United States if you're here from the United States. In New York, where I am, there are many. In Los Angeles, there are many. And it's just a matter of searching online for a meetup group that seems like it has cool people. Even where we are in New York, in Brooklyn, there's the IFP Made in New York Media Center, which is a great place for this kind of interdisciplinary work. POV also runs filmmaker meetups along with IFP, actually. And there may be some other organizations that I don't know of that are near you that foster this kind of work. Look for co-working spaces or places that are fostering social innovation. There are many kind of hackathon sorts of events as well. So POV runs POV Hackathon, and if you're in New York or where we're running a hackathon, come to those Sunday night screenings, come to the final presentations, because a big part of that is the mingling and meeting those people from your community. And bring business cards and bring your postcards and everything else you have. We actually ran a hackathon in the Hub in Los Angeles, which is a great place, and to do this sort of work in New York, we've run things around this kind of work. And there are other tech meetups, and even if you're not a tech person, you still might have a really great time by actually attending those meetups. And yeah, look for those mingling events. You never know what conference is going to be a place where you're going to meet your collaborators, so really get yourself out there if that wasn't obvious to you already. Do most people request projects that you've completed? I don't know that I understand exactly. I guess the question is does funding come once the projects are completed, or do you have a better chance or not a worse chance from proposing just an idea? And if that's the question, POV has a range of funding opportunities, and we kind of cover from the experimental and research side up until the completed work. So for us, it's just finding the right, okay, you've clarified. I'm going to answer this question anyways. But it's a matter of just finding the right place for where you're at. So if you're at the experimental stage and you're early on, then POV Hackathon is a great thing. So you're not going to get any money out of it, but you'll get a prototype out of it, and then you can keep going. Whereas we have a co-production grant, and the co-production grant tops out at $50,000, and that's much more of a very strong either completed something, or it's well in production, or there's the capability that you've shown to make that thing is very high. And it could be done because we've actually licensed things that have been completed, but for the most part, we're in the co-production and on the higher end. So, and Susan actually clarified her question. So the question is, do they want examples of projects that you've already completed? And for me, the answer is absolutely yes. I want to see that you've done something in the past. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. And it may not be that you've done it, but it may be that one of your collaborators has done something. But I do want to see that there's a precedent for the kind of work that you're doing. I want to see that if we give you the money, that there's a better chance that you'll actually be able to execute on the idea. And it's a little bit about minimizing risk. I mean, I love taking risks on projects, but if you just, on your resume from previous things you've done from your CV, do not have the resume for that shows that you're able to do great work, then it's going to be tougher. But having that CV is really nice. Having previous work is really nice. But at the same time, we've worked with many people who've never done anything before, but they've been able to achieve something great in some other aspect. So we've taken them on to know that they can execute on something. So I hope that answers your question, Susan. Okay, Ken has another funding question. Are there limits to hardware purchases when it comes to requesting the, whoever you're going for? For when we write a check, the check isn't necessarily going to cover everything. I mean, it's not going to cover the entire project. Maybe it will. If you have hardware that you need to buy, I mean, you can probably buy it out of that check, because it's not saying, I'm not going to say in a check that I write, it's not going to say $5,000 of this is going to go for computers, and like 2,000 is going to go for software, things like that. But I do want to know what those things are for and how you're going to use them in your project. So right now we're doing this co-production funding, and part of the funding must go towards software and hardware, because certainly you're going to need some hardware and certainly going to need some software, but I don't need to be broken out as a line item because the check itself isn't going to pay for that hardware directly. That's kind of up to you. So Ken, let me know if that answered your question. Otherwise, we'll keep moving on. Okay, great, thanks, Ken. So, and if there's any questions about collaborators, I almost finished everything I wanted to say about collaboration, so feel free to jump in and do the same thing that everyone else is doing. Just type in collaborators : and then I'll answer that question. So the last piece that I want to say, so presumably most people that are here are filmmakers or media creators, and your first thought is, yeah. And the reality is you might not need a developer. You might need a designer, or you might actually need more people to help you on the media creation side. It's going to depend on the project, what it is, but don't necessarily think that you have to hire a certain kind of person or find a certain kind of collaborator. Look at the project and what the project needs are. It's very important, we'll get into this momentarily, but it's very important that the team that you have has the right skills to make the thing that you want to make. I've seen often, or not often, but sometimes I've seen when people or their friends or they've collaborated on something and they propose something, and the people who are, because you're obviously friends with people, you have a history of making projects together, and you just don't have the skills to do the thing that you want to do. So you'll have to go to outsiders and really kind of fill those gaps. For a small team, the way that we do them at the POV Hackathon Lab, we actually like to have a 4-person team, and the 4-person team usually consists of a director. I mean, there's always exceptions, of course, but there's a director and then a producer on the media making side there to, they may be an editor, they may be an associate producer who knows social media well, they may be an impact producer. But there's essentially 2 people from the media side and then 2 people from the technology side. One person who's a developer, probably a web developer, who knows front-end coding, and the 4th person is usually a designer, so a web designer. And between those 4 people, you're usually able to make a prototype and probably do pretty good work, but it will depend on the project. The great thing about the hackathon structure is that if you haven't applied already, or if you will apply with the extension, we do the matchmaking for you. So if you propose the idea, we'll look at the other database of the people who apply from the technology side, and we'll try to do the skills matchup. But it's really critical to have the right people on the team. So that's all I wanted to say about collaborators. Are there any questions about that? Continue to ask using collaborators : question. But I'm going to move on to skills. And this is a little bit shorter than the other sections. So the question about skill, I need to learn to code. I need to learn how to code. The answer is no. But it is very useful to know the language that your technologist will be using. It's tough to manage a technologist if you can't speak a little bit of their language. So learn where you can. And learning means something that we're going to talk about momentarily, but learning means being aware of the work that's being done and the tools that are being used. At POV, we like to share the tools that we're using. So just coming back to the POV Hackathon, everyone that comes to the POV Hackathon, we actually share the tools that everyone uses. So we make sure that all the technologists on the team list out every technology that they use. We interview them to describe more about how they use those tools. We also have a technology fellow who's working with us right now for a year, and that's essentially all that he's doing. He's making tools and sharing them with people. So you can read our blog, and you can read from the POV Hackathon archive project site, and look around on the web and read interviews with interactive creators and see what they're saying and see what tools they're using. Because when you talk to a technologist, it'll be that much easier to have that common language. So there are a few places that you can learn. Code Academy is one of those well-known places, but there are many free resources online to learn how to do some basic coding. But also the reality about learning how to code is that if you don't have a project to work on with that code, you will probably forget it very quickly. So think about it just as an introduction, and think about it as a way to just have that common language. Now, if you already know how to code, then this question is irrelevant to you. But you still want to make sure that your collaborators have complementary skills so that you can actually make the thing that you make. So that's all I wanted to say about skills. And I'm going to pause for a moment, again, if people have questions about getting skills or where to get them, or do I have enough skills to make this thing? And also about collaborators, or if you still have funding questions, feel free to ask at any time and I'll answer them. Otherwise, I'll move on to how to envision a project as opposed to how to plan a project. Okay, so let's move ahead. So a lot of reading on this slide, but I'm going to keep this slide up essentially for the rest of this presentation, so you can take your time with it. I advocate a 4-step process for creative collaboration and coming up with projects like interactive projects. And the 4 steps are envision, which is what you see that we're going to focus on, but then also prioritize, prototype, and publish. So in the interactive world, you probably hear a lot of people saying that, oh, you have to iterate and you have to prototype. And that's absolutely true. And there are a few exceptions to that. But I'm not going to focus so much on that process. I want to stay more on the early stage, the pre-production sort of part, and that's envision. So, and just like everything else that we're doing today, feel free to jump in. If you're doing this question, colon, and then ask your question. So let's start with envision. So again, some of these things can be done in a different order, but I think all of these things are really important to do. And so I've got decide why you're doing this. You really have to think about primarily what is your motivation? What are your goals? Because the project that you do should really come out of your motivation. It should not come out of, I saw someone else doing something and I'd like to copy it because I think it works. That's not really a very strong motivation. You want to decide why you're doing this, and that'll influence everything that happens after it. It'll also give you guideposts to say that this makes sense for our project and this doesn't make sense for the project. So it's really important early on to at least try to come close to what you hope you are trying to do. And certainly some of that is going to change over time, but to do it at the top is a really great thing. Too often overlooked, and it's kind of depressing for me, because it's the part where people fail, where they don't realize what has come before. So, and there are a lot of places to actually see interactive work, and I'll list some of those for you right now, so you might want to take these notes because I've not written them down. I'm going to list three places to go, and of course, if you just do a web search for them, they'll come up. So the first one is MIT DocuBase, so that's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's in a growing list, and they actually go a little bit beyond what we would call interactive documentaries, so there's a few other things there. There's also, if you Google for Toronto Doc Shift, there's also a good list of projects there. And then IDFA Doc Lab, so that's the Amsterdam Documentary Conference, IDFA, IDFA Doc Lab. So those are databases of places. There are also a few places to look, again, that are doing interactive work. The National Film Board of Canada, in Canada, is doing a lot of great work and has for years. Arte, which is a French-German broadcaster, has also been doing great work for many years in an interactive documentary world. But then go beyond. Look at the New York Times. They've been doing great things. Look at the Guardian. Other newspapers frequently do good work. Maybe it's less often than the New York Times, but there are many newspapers, and you may know your local newspaper does great work. Look at what they do. And yes, you can look at other interactive projects, but also go beyond that. Play video games, read books, visit museums, have other kinds of life adventures, because all these things are going to influence your ideas of what you can do online. The more out there, the better. You can look for experimental art, which is also really interesting. You could also look at science. So I found myself recently asking, after discussing with interactive creators at the early stage, I find myself asking a lot, what's the science behind this? And sometimes people go, I don't know that there's no science behind this, but there is science behind it. So, do that research, look up the precedents, see what's happened, take some risks and have some experience. The worst thing that you can do is propose an idea that's already been done and didn't succeed for the exact reasons that you think it will succeed. And unfortunately, I've seen many of those things. As you are doing that, keep doing it. And I told people, as they've already done, it's a critical step, and people skip it too often. So please put some emphasis on the research. Get as much input as you can. So once you have that input, then it's time to imagine what the thing could be. And this is really the core thing. I want to see the novelty. I want to see what's exciting about this. I want to see what's different about it. And imagining the experience actually has nothing to do with technology. It's really just about taking all that input that you've done and all the things that you've seen, all the different kinds of interactions that can happen, and writing down, well, what could that be, or drawing what it could be. And you really can't do that unless you have the right input. So that's important, but the research actually gets you most of the way there. And it's just even one of the core things about creativity, which is just mashing two things together that never have come together before. But if you don't have the input, then you're not able to mash things together because your database in your brain is not big enough. So imagining is the next step there. But of course, things can be done a little bit out of order. It's certainly not everyone in the world. You've got to figure out who is it for. If it's to influence a certain action, who are the right people that need to see it to influence that action? So as an example, you may be running a project that can only, that's a grassroots project, and you're hoping for a grassroots change. Well, in that case, you want many people to see it, but there's still like a certain demographic. And on the other extreme, there's only one person who can do something about it, and maybe that's the President of the United States. And in that case, the grassroots thing may not be the right approach. And these are, of course, extreme examples. A typical kind of example that I like to give is maybe you're in not New York City, maybe you're in a smaller town, and maybe the right person to reach is the mayor's chief of staff. That may be the influential person, and only one person needs to see your project. But of course, the reality is that you probably want more people to see it, and there's probably a demographic. You just need to decide what it is, and it has to fit with the project that you ultimately decide. Okay, so more about the audience. It does tie back into the goal. If your goal is art, then it's very different than if your goal is to do journalism or activism. So just be aware, coming from what your goal is, and go from there. And we have Usame on the chat window has given us a suggestion of crossvideodays.com as another source for projects. Thank you. So that's the audience piece, targeting an audience, and you absolutely have to target an audience. It's just critical. It also just shows that you have thought through your project and that you know it's for a specific group of people. Okay, I'm going to go back to a question here on the imagine part. So the question is, in imagining what it could be, how important is it to think about from the beginning the things that can be developed from the interactive project? For example, the companion ebooks, the interactive teaching materials, possibly the video game based on the initial concept, and should these concepts be included in the original proposals? Okay, that's a good question. And actually, there's a couple things that I want to say even about the phrasing of your question. So it's important to think about the right thing. Actually, it's my next bullet point, so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. But you want to think about what the right form is for your story. And if you propose, and I've seen proposals like this, if you propose that you're going to do 15 things, you'll probably be laughed at by the funder because they'll say this person doesn't really understand their audience or what they're actually trying to achieve. And it's really nice that you want to be creative and do all those things, but it's expensive and it takes people, and it's much, much better, from my perspective, to focus on a small number of things that are achievable. That doesn't mean that small is the wrong word. You pick one of those things and you want it to be achievable, and it can be ambitious. It can be ambitious, but saying that you're going to do 15 things, or even what you mentioned here, ebooks and teaching materials and video games, it's kind of bordering on a lot of stuff. And you'd want to say, this is what's most important, and this is the hub of the content. And you could say that these are some other things that we're thinking about. but it's tough for me to get excited about someone who is proposing 15 things at the same time. So, and if that doesn't answer your question or if you follow up, please ask again. But I'm going to move on because we've sort of leaped into the next point, which is about picking the right story or picking the right platform or the right thing, the right media, even right medium. So people pitch Hollywood movies where they say, can you imagine it on the one sheet? Can you imagine the poster? Or what's the high concept, that thing, the elevator pitch version, that thing that you can just say in a sentence? And it's been a really good guidepost, because if you can explain to people in just a few words what the project is, it shows people that you are focused and you understand what your project is, and you also understand how you're going to market it. And not that I care as much about marketing at this stage, but really for a project to be successful, you have to have clarity about what it is. And if you have a statement like that, then you're much more likely to have a successful project. And if you have a successful project, it's going to be easier to market that project. So high concept is usually good. The elevator, or call it an elevator pitch, just that stuff is really great. And if you have envisioned this project well. So that's important. Now, remember, like we're talking about with this previous question, yes, all those things are possible, but what's the best one? You've decided by making an interactive project, let's say, that it's better than a documentary. And I've had a lot of conversations with people who say, don't make this interactive project, just make it as a documentary. The documentary format will be perfect for this. There's nothing that gets added by doing this other thing that you proposed. With other people, it will be, I will say, this is a mess of a documentary. Please do not make this documentary. But this interactive piece is really, really interesting. And I would hope that they would pursue that. And when I have those conversations, it's not that they've proposed 15 things, it's that they've proposed one thing. So I actually like that. So pick the right story, pick the right medium, and it can be ambitious within that thing that you've selected, but just be aware that you will actually have to do this at some point. So try to focus in on what the best story is. So I'm just going to repeat something that Christian had popped in the feed in response to that last question. And he says, also the formats you pick should be organic to your audience behavior. So thank you. So it ties back to the understanding the audience part, which I mentioned earlier. Okay, so the last part of the envisioning is finding partners. And what I mean by partners here is not the collaborators like the technologists. This means like distribution partners and, say, NGOs or nonprofits or people who will help you get the word out. And they do more than get the word out. They will help you validate your idea. And validating actually comes in two forms. One is validating because they want to be part of the project. They validate it in that way. But also that they validate the project because they have a channel that you might be able to use in order to help feed the content of your interactive documentary, or they may have some sort of distribution channel. So, and it happens a lot where people will pitch a product to me and I'll say, who are your partners? And the person will say that we don't have any partners. And then I'll list a few people just off the top of my head of organizations that I've heard of that might be interested in that thing. So it is really important to reach those partners, because when you apply to me and I see that you have other people on board, it validates the idea, and it also points to the potential because you have that partnership built in, that you'll have a distribution outlet. So these are really a quick overview about the envisioning part. So this is the pre-production part, the things that you want to think about before you get started. And you really, really do want to do these things first. It's really detrimental when someone completes a project and then they start the interactive part. So let's say, I'm assuming many of you on this chat right now have a documentary project and you're thinking about converting it into an interactive documentary, something like that. Well, do that as early as possible, because if you think that this interactive project is marketing for your documentary, it could still work, but it's an uphill battle. So just be aware of that. So I like thinking about a lot of these things, and I tell people to think about these things early on. And then once you're envisioning something, once you have a vision for what the thing is going to be by doing all of these kinds of things, the next steps are these three things that I'm going to just say very, very quickly, which I've talked about elsewhere, is to figure out, okay, now that you have your best story and you think you know what you want to do, what's the first step? You want to prioritize something. So in the context of a hackathon, you're thinking, what can I do? What can I prioritize? Because I only have essentially a day to make something. So you can't do everything in a day. You pick the first most important thing to prioritize. And then prototypes are wonderful. Prototypes are great because they let funders actually see the real thing. And that's, it's hard for people to imagine on paper, but as soon as you have a prototype, things become much more real. And I've seen this happen many times where people have a great project and it's on paper and no one's interested. And as soon as there's a prototype, suddenly interest has come out of nowhere. So that does happen. And the last part of this, this four-step process is the publisher. And it's really important to get the work out into the world so that you can get feedback. And then once you have that feedback, you can actually iterate. So you can actually start this process again. So you can re-envision, which is not so terrible. You've done much of this research already. But after publishing, you're going to have all kinds of new information. And then you can envision better. And it's just a matter of whether you're going to keep iterating on this project or whether you're going to think about the envisioning for the next project now that you've had the experience of doing this. But just like a film, if you are a filmmaker, you know, a film is never complete. It's abandoned. So you can decide the same way with an interactive project if you want to keep it in beta and it was not really great. But if you've done this the right way, you've not invested a lot of time very early, that you can just say, you know, I can envision something much better. I'm going to actually get rid of 90% of what I thought I was going to do and just work off of that 10%. Re-envision. So I'm going to stop there. And I do want to hear more of your questions about anything that I've said or your specific questions about what you're doing. So feel free to jump in and I'll try to do them in order. So first person gets the first answer. So Usama, you're first. So your question is, could you name your pick of the best 3 interactive docs you've seen and experienced so far? Yes, I'll give you a few. And actually maybe, let's see what I can do about that. So some projects that I've really loved recently, well, first are my babies, so I have to tell you about the POE projects. We, in the last month or so, have released 6 interactive projects, and I think they're all interesting, not just because they're mind-blowing projects, but because they're all actually quite small. We actually call them shorts. So we call them POE interactive shorts. So you'll see small ideas that are tested, and you can see what people can do on very short time frames. So the URL for that is pbs.org/POV/digital. So you can see a number of things there. You can also see related to that, you can also go to pov.org/hackathon and see previous hackathon projects. And a lot of those projects are really interesting and are progressing quickly. So there's that. Some of the projects that I've seen, kind of landmark projects recently, there was a project that I really liked called it's the Guardian's NSA Decoded project, which is quite popular at this point. It was done by the Guardian, again, a newspaper that is doing interactive work. And this was based on some of the Snowden revelations. And it's just really nice for many reasons. And it's subtle in many reasons, but also uses the best parts of the web that you can imagine. So maybe while I'm talking, Christian can help find that link and plug it in. And another project that was really revolutionary, it's quite old at this point, but it was from late 2012, was Snowfall from the New York Times. And it also points to something that people, I love the word scrollytelling, so it points to this scrollytelling kind of thing, and it really launched that whole genre. But it was the first and really still is, if not the best, one of the best. So that's Snowfall from the New York Times. So maybe that's 3 projects. But there are many more. Really, I encourage you to look around for award winners. So recently, the News and Documentary Emmy Awards were last week, and so you can look at the nominees for the News and Documentary Emmy Awards in the New Approaches category, which is really interesting. And there are many other places where you can look up awards. So another question from Susan. You mentioned a prototype. Does that mean that the project is near complete and you've provided funding to finish the project? So a prototype does not mean completion, but the way that I think about this loop is I call it a prototype in this four-step process, but really like a film, you abandon it. So at a certain point, you're iterating and you just say, it's done. And you're just constantly making it better and better. And at some point, it's done and you leave it there. So when I talk about prototyping in the POV hackathon context, it's the first time anyone's doing anything. So it's the first prototype. And that's really important when I talk about having that prototype. The first prototype is really, really important. So when you say, does a prototype need to be complete in order to get funding? No, because then your project is done and you probably don't need much more. But if you can show early on the concept of what it is in a real way using a prototype, then it just helps people imagine what that thing is. And I like to think that I can imagine a project based on paper, but I also still love to see even just something really rough. Because you'll get 70% of the concept or what the functionality is going to be or what the usability is like or what's unique about it or what the novelty is or how they're using the technology. So those are all things that you can whip together pretty quickly in your own kind of internal hackathon format. And actually, when a project is completed, it's different. I would, if a project is closer to completion, I wouldn't call it a prototype. It's more like, it's a semantic thing. You might call it a beta or you might call it a finished thing, or version 1. It's the language we use. We have betas, and then we say version 1 and version 2. So, it might be like a version 1 that you're sharing. Any more questions?
All right, I think that might be it for questions. And thank you so much, Adnaan. Look, we have one more.
Okay, we'll answer this one. We're going to keep sneaking the questions in. Okay, so Osama's question is: when you go over applications, what are the most common 3 mistakes? Okay, so the biggest mistake, I don't know if I can list 3, but the biggest mistake is failing to do essentially what we've talked about, failing to envision. And if you haven't done the research, you're not going to be able to envision something. And we can see right through that. If you haven't done the work, if you don't really know what the precedents are, then it doesn't pass the first gate. So I think I'm just going to stop at 1 and say that's it. We also actually have on our website, actually I'll try to pull this up while I'm talking. We do have submission tips for the POV hackathon, which actually are very similar to what I would suggest for funding. And if I can find that really quickly, I'm going to share that with you, and I'll put it in the field. And I'll tell you the title so you can actually search for it later. So the title of this blog post, which is on pbs.org/POV, the title is POV Hackathon. Actually answer Osama's question here by reading the things you shouldn't do. But you can actually just go back and read this post on your own time as well. And I'll put it into the thing so you can read along here. So there's a section of this thing that says 6 red flags from rejected applications, and I'll read them out. They're all quotes. Number 1 is, I'm looking for ideas. And my response to that is that you should probably have an idea before you propose something. Number 2 is, I want to make a website. And my response is that you don't need a hackathon to make a website, and a website is very, very broad. So make sure that you're focused, like we talked about. Number 3 was, I need a social media strategy. And really, social media may have nothing to do with the interactive project. So that's a more of a marketing question than an interactive project question. Number 4 is, I saw a film that used technology X, and I'd like to use it too. And for me, we're really into innovation with technology, and other people may disagree with that, but we are really interested in pushing technology. So I want to see you doing something with a new technology or using technology in a new way. So that's a red flag for me as well. Number 5 is, I'm so excited someone else is going to do all that tech stuff. And my response to that is that the reality is that they're not excited about doing the tech stuff, that you must be a collaborator. So you're not going to propose half of an idea and hand it off to someone. You have to be actively engaged with this thing the whole way through. And then number 6 is saying, my project is innovative, it's going to reinvent transmedia. And my response to that is that I really don't appreciate buzzwords. We don't use the word transmedia at POV, it doesn't mean anything to us. And to say that your project is just going to be the best project ever needs to be backed up in some way. So we really just appreciate that clarity over the superlatives. So Usama, you got 7 answers instead of 3, but you can read this blog post later. It's titled POV Hackathon Submission Tips for Filmmakers.
Excellent.
The more the better, yes.
Exactly. Thank you, Adnaan. Really appreciate you taking the time. And it looks like we have more questions. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then we have to close it out.
Okay. Oh, hi, Britta. I know you. Nice to see you here. Can you recommend an efficient, easy this is a great question because very often in interactive projects, people make them and then forget that they actually have to get them out into the world. And I don't have one answer for you, but partners are very, very helpful. So if you have, let's say something that most people on this call do not have, but let's say you have a partnership with the New York Times. Okay, that's huge. Or if you have a partnership with, a major magazine like Wired, someone like that, then you have like a very easy way to make a big splash. But these partners that we talked about, these NGOs or nonprofits, they might also have very significant distribution channels that you can use as well. So it's about planning early on who your audience is, what your market is, and everything is guided from that. So you'll be able to figure out, oh, these partners are really good and they have an audience and we can use them. And then the hope is, of course, that you're going to transcend that group. But you're asking, Britta, if there's an easy release strategy, and I would say that there is no easy strategy, but I'm actually just finishing a thought that I may not have finished, that sometimes when people release projects, actually most times when people release projects, these kinds of things are not seen. Very few people see them. So because they haven't thought about anything really about the distribution part of it. So it's important to think of that stuff early. And partners are really, really great because if you're starting a new thing, your Facebook page has 3 likes and your Twitter feed has 3 followers, then you're not going to get a lot of traction inherently from that. So the partners will give you a boost really early on.
Great.
Okay.
And
So
our last
question?
Yes, let's tackle it.
Okay. Hi, Carl. I don't know if I know you, Carl. I know Carl Scott. If that's you, then you can talk to me later. Okay, oh, that's you. Okay, hey, Carl. I haven't talked to you in years. I hope you're doing well. Okay, so Carl's question is a partnership question. How often do you encounter developers looking to involve themselves in predetermined interactive projects rather than media creators seeking them out? I can tell you from the perspective of the POV Hackathon, which is that people apply to participate in the POV Hackathon because they're really excited about working with storytellers. And we give them a structure for it. So it's easier for people to apply to us than it is for you to connect, for a developer to connect with you. Now I know you're a media maker and a developer, so you have special skills. You'll have the language to talk to people. But it's really the same thing that I said before about work. But I want to just make sure I'm specifically answering your question. So predetermined interactive projects. So yeah, so you mean that you've decided to have a topic, and I think that's great. I really like that. If you are coming from a certain perspective and saying this is what my thing is about, then people can actually buy into the thing. Like they can buy into the topic. And that's great because I've had the situation where I've helped pair people up and they're not interested in, they weren't interested, but I tell them, well, here's this thing. And I'm really interested in that subject. I want to work for free on that. Maybe you want to get them for free, but they want to work for free on that subject because they're so excited about it. They believe in it so passionately. But I think you've got to you've got to hustle to find those people because it's not, like I said, it's not easy. But having the project ready and something to pitch them is really great. At the same time, you don't want the idea to be totally finished. You want them to be collaborators, and you want the technologist to be as involved in your project as you are, essentially. In the same way that if you're a filmmaker and you've paired up with a producer, you know that that producer has to be as passionate about it as you are. They may be coming from a slightly different perspective, but you both have that shared common thing underneath it all.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Adnan. That's very, very helpful. And everyone, take a look at the screen, and you should see the upcoming schedule of our future sessions. And the recording of this session should be up on the website very soon at blackpublicmedia.org/MBPC360. So check it out then, and please do share the information with your fellow producers and everyone, really, because we think these sessions are useful even if you don't yet have an idea for MBPC 360. We'll also be having every other week digital office hours held on the same format as these, but we would give producers a chance to have more one-on-one questions about ideas that they're thinking about. Right now we sort of keep the questions general so everybody learns from them, but in the digital office hours we're open to answering very specific questions about your planned applications, because we really want to make sure that you're applying with the right ideas and with the right teams. Before we close it out, I just want to say a huge thank you to Adnaan and to POV for being great partners on this and kicking us off. And also want to thank you guys for being our first class and an awesome audience. So just opening it up to anyone who has any general questions for MVPC or MVPC 360 before we go ahead and close it out. But thank you, everyone, and hope to see you next week.